I ended my last lecture with this iconic painting, and I'm hoping you'll choose to earn some extra credit by watching more of the excellent video discussing this work. So let me make just a few additional points. The tricorn hat, which I've circled in green, was a symbol of the French Revolution. Also, Delacroix signed the painting on the barricades. I've circled the signature in red, which drew attention to this, again, iconic element of the revolution. In the 1850s, after another street-led revolution in 1848, the French political leadership enlisted the architect Baron Haussmann to remake Paris into the city of wide, tree-lined avenues that we enjoy today. The alleged goal was to make the city more sanitary. The unspoken, but probably more important goal was to make it harder for the riffraff to throw up barricades. Note that Delacroix rendered the allegorical figure of victory quite unallegorically. Art critics at the time weren't especially dismayed by her bare breasts, nothing new there, but they were dismayed by the dirt on her dress and the way she thrust herself into the midst of the battle rather than hovering decorously in the air. The newly installed bourgeois king, Louis Philippe, bought the painting and hung it in the palace gallery. After the Parisian mob staged another rebellion in 1832, the king had the painting taken down and returned to Delacroix. When the Revolution of 1848 brought in another republic, liberty leading the people came out of storage and was actually displayed in the Academy Salon of 1855. In 1874, it entered the collection of the Palais du Louvre in Paris, where it's now one of France's most cherished images. I'm going to flip through just a few more works by Delacroix, both to prepare you for a possible attribution question and to illustrate some other elements of Romanticism. So in the ongoing battle between line and color, Poussin and Rubens, which side do you think Delacroix took? Well, I've already mentioned that Ingres inherited the mantle of Poussin in line, and I would argue that even the raft of the Medusa was more focused on line. Delacroix, though, was the great advocate of color. We see Rubens' influence especially clearly in this painting. Well, why do I say that? Well, it's hard to miss the voluptuous nudes, a little slimmer, the carefully modeled figures, the vibrant colors, and of course the pyramidal composition. The story, however, comes from contemporary literature, specifically a poem by the great Romantic poet Lord Byron, and the setting is the ever-popular exotic, although in this case ancient Near East. Basically, an Assyrian king has learned that his armies have been defeated, so he has his guards kill off his women, slaves, and horses. More Orientalism with the usual dose of sex and horror to keep our interest. Here we see the fascination with Orientalism combined with headline news. In 1822, inhabitants of the Greek island of Chios tried to join the Greek War of Independence. Ottoman Turks invaded the island and killed or enslaved tens of thousands of islanders. This war fascinated and horrified the classically attuned Western European elites. The Romantic poet Byron, whom I've just mentioned, would die fighting for Greece. Here's still another element of Romanticism, which we saw in the Raft of the Medusa as well. Romantic painters often chose current events and what they saw as ongoing injustice as the subject of their works. Of course, that's part of liberty leading the people, too. And here are some paintings that Delacroix made after a visit to North Africa in 1832. Earlier, he had painted the struggle between humans, but increasingly he turned to combat between nature and man or between animals. The dangerous power of nature is another popular Romantic theme. Okay, German Romanticism has fallen off the list, but I can't ignore this famous painting altogether. Germany was the epicenter of a particularly gloomy and dramatic form of Romanticism, represented above all by the great poet and dramatist Goethe. His works inspired a cult of solitary, sorrowful, romantic young men seeking the meaning of life in an often unforgiving world or nature. And here he is. Friedrich, the artist who painted Our Solitary Young Man, was especially famous for his winterscapes. I'm throwing this in mostly because I just really like this painting. But take a close look at the upper right. Friedrich has painted in a shipwreck, once again highlighting that struggle between man and nature. I love the rhythm of this painting with its strong parallel diagonals and, of course, its pyramidal composition. So the English Romantics were just as enamored of nature and just as eager to get in touch with their feelings, but they were far too British to engage in a lot of German angst. But you'd never guess it from this painting, but what we're seeing here is actually a reaction to the other great set of 19th century revolutions, which we usually lump together under the term Industrial Revolution. England gave birth to the manufacturing technology that would transform the lives of ordinary people, and the country soon became the richest in the world. But artists such as Constable were mostly dismayed by industrialization's impact on the countryside, the displaced agricultural workers, the pollution, the agrarian riots, and a kind of loss of innocence. In this famous painting, no longer on the list, Constable seeks to recapture the rural simplicity of his rural Suffolk childhood. Okay, enough recapping and detouring. Here is our next required work. I actually have an excuse for hanging on to my Friedrich and Constable slides. I want you to think about what's different about the Oxbow, which is probably the most famous painting of the so-called Hudson River School. For that matter, what might be different about American Romanticism? I think the quote that I've included offers a pretty strong clue. It seems to me that while Cole is also addressing the sublime, note he even uses the term, sublime in his American context refers more to nature's wild beauty than to its wild terrors. Note the word birthright. Art historians associate Cole with the notion of manifest destiny, an idea very popular in America that God had given this land to Americans, that is, white European Americans, to settle. He's also asserting a uniquely American artistic vision at a time when writers such as James Fenimore Cooper, Edgar Allan Poe, and Washington Irving were also laying claim to a uniquely American literary vision. Cole, by the way, was an emigre from Britain. He arrived in the U.S. in 1818 at the age of 17. He painted this work partly to respond to a British art critic who claimed that Americans did not pay attention to their own scenery. Nor does Cole seem to be claiming, along the lines of British romantics such as Constable, that the countryside is being despoiled. In the same essay he wrote, and I quote, "The imagination can scarcely conceive Arcadian vales more lovely or more peaceful than the valley of the Connecticut. Its villages are rural places where trees overspread every dwelling, and the fields upon its margin have the richest verdure." But why might I think Cole is a little more ambiguous about settlement than this quote seems to indicate? The circle might offer a clue. Well, it seems to me that this painting quite deliberately contrasts the raw beauty of wild nature with the still lovely but much plainer settled land on the right. Is this a tribute to the way Americans have tamed nature and made it fruitful? Or do we detect a note of wistfulness, even regret? Where, after all, has this artist chosen to hang out? That's his self-portrait I've circled in red. As we see from this close-up, he's chosen to hang out in the wilderness, not in the Arcadian settlement. What do you notice about his brushstrokes, by the way? We're seeing more of those loose daubs of bright color, very characteristic of most, though not all, romantic work. Remember, Ingres had very tight brushstrokes. Cole also illustrated James Fenimore Cooper's Last of the Mohicans, which mourned the passing of the noble savage, another of Rousseau's favorite themes. I think this painting also suggests at least a little ambiguity about progress. Some art historians, and this was in your video, think that Cole left a hidden message in the Oxbow. The word Noah is roughly incised in Hebrew letters, a code that read upside down, God's eye view, spells out Shaddai, the Almighty. So the landscape isn't just an American birthright, it's a beautiful element of God's creation. Romantic painters were generally more sympathetic to religion, but this was especially true in the United States, where rebellion against religion was not as major an element of the Enlightenment. For that matter, American romantics weren't as likely to rebel against reason. Our Enlightenment revolution had ended quite well, thank you very much. Indeed, Cole's last paintings were explicitly religious, and that was true of paintings of other landscape painters of the Hudson River School, who aren't on the list. Okay, he's not on the list either, but since we live in the West, I have to throw in another famous American landscape painter who has shown up on AP tests in the past and who is sometimes associated with the Hudson River School, even though he mostly painted California, Sierra Nevada mountains and the prairies. So this too is nature sublime, but again, not as terrifying. And here's another Bierstadt painting, this time with human figures portrayed as noble pioneers fulfilling the call to settle America from sea to sea. I haven't seen plains with mountains quite like that very often, but at any rate, we see more manifest destiny, a point that has shown up on past AP exams. Okay, this was a painting I didn't know, and I really look forward to seeing it in the flesh, so to speak, when I travel to Mexico City soon. The artist painted 50 years after the oxbow, but I think you'll see some important similarities. So what are they? Well, there are compositional similarities. We have a bird's eye view. We have the contrast between wilderness and civilization, the hillside in the foreground, the thunderstorm receding in the distance, the tiny figures captured in the wild portion of the painting. And this too is a nationalist work asserting a Mexican vision of nature and history. It's very much about Mexican national identity. Velasco probably understood what he was looking at better than Cole did before entering the Academy of San Carlos, which, by the way, was the first art academy and the first art museum in the Americas. It was in Mexico City. Velasco studied zoology and botany at the nearby medical school. He also studied mathematics, geology, and surveying. So in some ways, he's really an Enlightenment as well as a Romantic figure. Okay, I know I'm repeating the Khan Academy video you watched, or I hope you watched, but in the distance we see important historical landmarks. Circled in red is the Basilica of Guadalupe next to the hill of Tepeyac, where the Virgin of Guadalupe appeared to Juan Diego. The roads marked out in purple are the ancient Aztec causeways, now Mexican roads leading into Mexican City. The ancient Aztec capital Tenochtitlan was built on Lake Texcoco, which I've circled in green. At this point, it was receding under the pressure of agricultural industrial development. And here we see the ancient volcanoes that, according to Aztec legend, represented two ill-fated lovers, an Aztec princess and a courageous warrior. The Khan Academy experts pronounce these names. I'm not that brave or that competent. The similarities in the two paintings are probably not accidental. Velasco would have known American landscape painting. And like Cole, he was making a patriotic point about his nation's beautiful landscape and dramatic history. Velasco was a product of and the poster child for a very deliberate effort by the Mexican government to train Mexican artists and to produce a distinctively Mexican art. He was also the first Mexican painter to achieve international prominence. So here's another Velasco landscape and another Valley of Mexico that showcases his knowledge of Mexican geology and botany. A cool little factoid, in 1879, Velasco discovered a rare species of salamander that was later named after him, in Latin, of course. So which of our other required painters shared this botanical interest? Rachel Reusch. Note that the religious element appeared in our required image and is much stronger in this later painting. I also detect the influence of Turner. Stay tuned.